Hello, my name is Terry Kenny, and I'm a surface water specialist with the Water Science Field Team. In this video, we are going to discuss how to develop multiple offset ratings using GRSAT, and we're going to be building upon a lot of the information and methods and skills that were presented in earlier videos in this video series on GRSAT. As you can see here, I have GRSAT open, and I am going to open the file, the XML file of the primer that I'm going to show you here. So I'm going to click on From File, and I would navigate to where it's at. This is the multiple offset primer. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to click Open, and then I'm going to read data. And what you see here is the last or the existing rating for this specific site, the Noxubee River near Geiger, Alabama. What you can see is, if you go into the Offset Manager, that this is a single offset rating, but it's essentially a curve that was developed using a number of rating input points to define that curve as shown here. So as we showed in all the earlier videos, when we are going to be developing a new rating or changing an existing rating, the first step in the process is to essentially clone that existing rating so that you have one that you can work with. So I'm going to click on the clone rating tool, the little sheep icon shown here. I'm going to renumber this to rating number 24.0. I'm going to put in a remark, just a really quick and simple remark here, indicating we're developing a multiple offset rating. Now you would put in a more specific set of remarks or comments to describe why you did this, that sort of thing, something we definitely encourage. I'm going to remove the selected shifts. I don't need those coming over. I don't need any offsets coming over. I'm going to be developing my own. I can leave the measurement settings. Those seem just fine. And I'm going to click OK. And what you see here is essentially the exact same rating that was shown earlier. The offset changed, so you see somewhat of a different plotting going on here between 23.0, which is shown back here, and 24.0. But this is the one we are going to work in right here. And the first step, because we're building a new rating, is we want to pretty much get rid of the existing rating points that were here from the previous rating. And there's a number of ways you can do this. You can go into the rating table here, and you can select different rows. You can select multiple rows, click the X, it deletes them as shown here. You can utilize some of the tools or the graphical buttons shown above here. Here's the delete rating points. I can draw a box around the area I'm interested in deleting. They go away, and you can see the rating table updated dynamically. And then I can continue drawing a box around here to delete those rating points. And you'll see in the rating table pane here, there are no inputted rating points. Similarly, there are no triangles connected by lines, and there are no lines shown here. So we now know that all we're looking at right now is a plot of the measurements for this station. The next step, as discussed in some of the earlier videos, is to remove or filter out measurements that you don't want to include in the development of the rating. Measurements you'd want to filter out would be older types of measurements, measurements associated with control conditions other than clear conditions. Essentially, you want to filter out measurements that you don't want to put any weight into drawing the line for the rating curve. And so here we would go into the site visit data pane. I can click on the tab, drag it out, make it a little bit larger because I'm going to be working a bit in here in the filtering of measurements and unselecting them. There are a number of different ways in GRSAT to unselect measurements or to reselect measurements. You can utilize the table here in the site visit data pane by sorting different columns, having the measurements sorted in different areas, selecting them, clicking the X to unselect them or the checkbox to check them, to select them. There are options to drag multiple rows to unselect them or to reselect them. You can take advantage of Windows shortcuts by selecting one row, going down, skipping a few rows, holding the Shift button down, clicking on a row somewhere down below, and all those in between will be highlighted. Again, you can unselect them, or you can reselect them in that same fashion. And there's the opportunity to utilize the time series view to select or deselect measurements based upon where they fall in time. Now, one of the first filters I want to apply to these data are to get rid of older measurements. I want to build my rating curve to be representative of current stage discharge relation conditions. So in taking that approach, I can select the time series view right here, and you have time on the x-axis and measure discharge on the y-axis. And I can paint a pretty broad brush here and deselect a number of measurements. For this rating curve that I'm building, I really don't want to develop a rating with data that's older than, say, about water year 2007. So I could go in the table over here and deselect a whole swath, but I can also do it here in the time series. So I'm going to click on this unselect measurement points, and I can draw a box around different measurements in the time series, and it unselects them. They showed up here, or unselected here in the rating table, the site visit table, excuse me, not the rating table. And they became gray on the plot of the rating you see right here. I can keep drawing a box at the time period I'm interested in, deselecting them. Takes a little bit sometimes, and they go away. So that's how you do it graphically in the time series viewer. You can also do it in the rating curve itself. I could go into the rating curve and unselect a measurement if I like. Select here, unselect rating measurement point, and I could remove this point right here if I wanted to. And now it's gray, and it will also be gray in the site visit pane. So to make it a little bit simpler, I am going to spend the rest of my time filtering measurements out in the site visit data pane. And so the first thing I want to do, like I said before, is remove older measurements. So I am sorting this. It's sorted by measurement date that it was made. And I want to get rid of everything prior to October 1st, 2006. So I can select and drag, click the X. I can go down here and find the next ones that haven't been selected. Select one and then scroll down to water year 2007 or just before that. And then I can hold down Shift, select that, and those measurements are now gone. To see where we're at, I'm going to click on Default Rating Shift Layout to stick the site visit data pane back in there. We can readily see which measurements we have filtered out just simply based upon our time filter, those that occurred prior to the water year 2007. So we need to do a little bit more filtering. We want to make sure we include only measurements that are associated with clear control conditions. So we're going to pull out the site visit data pane once again, and I'm going to sort this by control condition. And what you can see here, if I go all the way to the top, it's going to filter it alphabetically or sort it alphabetically. So I see clear conditions first, which are the ones I'm after. And I'm going to scroll down until I see debris type of or non-clear control conditions. And the first one I come across is LGDB. That is a light debris flag. Let's see where this measurement is. If I click on it, I get a halo around the measurement itself. And from what I can tell, this light debris is likely not affecting the stage discharge relation dramatically because there's no other measurements really plotted nearby other than that pink one. I am going to keep this measurement in because it's something I want to use when I build my rating. So I'm going to keep that in and keep scrolling down to the other control conditions that are not clear. Here I see a submerged one. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm getting rid of that submerged one. And then I start coming into what's known as unspecified control conditions. And these are basically control conditions that have not been indicated in the notes by whoever was in the field. So they could be clear control conditions. They could be something other than clear. So for now, we're going to keep those in. We have filtered out older measurements and undesirable control conditions. However, what we can see now is that we have filtered out a lot of higher flow measurements that were made in the past, and it's time to bring some of those back. I'm going to grab the site visit data pane, and I'm going to say to myself, I would like at least to see all measurements that have ever been made above 10,000 cubic feet per second. So I'm going to sort by discharge, go to the top of my pane here, click on it again, and I'm going to include or reselect discharge measurements greater than 10,000 cubic feet per second. So I'm going to just drag down because there's not all that many of them. And so I'm going to put a checkbox next to them. And we see that they show up in our rating plot. Now, there's quite a gap here in this segment of what we would expect to be the channel control part of the rating curve. And we're going to want to add some of those in as well. I am going to go back to my default rating shift layout, and I'm going to select these or re-input these graphically using the plotting window right here. So I am going to select measurement rating points, this curved red arrow, and I'm going to draw a box to the area I'm interested in right here. And all those measurements come back. Now notice there's quite a bit of scatter or kind of a larger cloud that's occurring somewhere in here, right around just short of 30 feet of stage. I'm going to zoom in there and unselect some of these measurements. Some of those that don't seem to plot on that same relation that is starting to show up. So I can use the zoom window up at the top, or the indicator of where the zoom is, and then deselect them here in the zoom window. I'm going to click on the unselect measurement points, and if I look up at this top pane, I see that these two red ones and these three pink ones are kind of in an area that I don't think is related to the stage discharge relation currently. So I'm going to draw some boxes around them, deselect them, they go away. And similarly, there's these two blue ones up here and right about here that don't seem to fit in this general trend. There's also a blue one just next to where I zoomed. So I'm going to grab this little hand for the panning, and I can grab this rating zoom box and move it so that what is in this box now is down here. And there's essentially this one measurement 674, that I would like to get rid of. It's coming down here. I'm going to unselect it. I'll make sure it's that one, 674, and I'm good to go. And it's gone. At this point, we've done a pretty good job of filtering out the measurements that we don't want to give any weight to as we develop our multiple offset rating. I'm going to back this out to the main view shown for the rating curve. And at this point, we have these gray measurements that are still showing up on our plot, but we probably don't want to see them or view them as we develop our rating utilizing the colored measurement points. I can click on the Show Hide Unselected Measurements button shown up here at the top, and you'll see all the gray measurements that we have unselected that we don't want to use don't show up anymore. It's pretty handy. We are now ready to start defining our rating curve. From the plot of measurements here, it is obvious that we have probably 3 unique hydraulic controls that control the stage discharge relation at this site. Each measurement should have notes on it that indicate what hydraulic control the flow was under at the time of the measurement. So I would have notes that help me out identifying where or about what range of stages different controls are active. I have this graphical plot here that certainly shows 3 distinct slopes or different angles. And I would like to have a cross-section, if it was available, to help me define certain important hydraulic points in the cross-section that indicate where controls may be transitioning. I'm going to present here my approach to defining and developing a multiple offset rating. you'll come to a comfortable method that you'll end up using. Some folks like to change the colors of the site visit data to indicate which measurements they want to include or which segments of measurements they want to include. I typically don't change the colors or mess with the site visit data at this point because I've already gone through the filtering aspect and I kind of want to leave it alone. It's set to where the measurements I want to use to build this rating are activated. The approach I take is fairly stepwise. I work in a fashion from the lowest hydraulic control segment into the next highest control segment and go from there. And the process I take is to essentially zoom into the segment I want to work on first and then work into the next segment from there. So I block out the other segments by zooming in and focusing on the measurements that are related to that hydraulic control. I'm going to start at the lower section control that probably goes from somewhere of about 7-8 feet of stage up to somewhere around 10, 11, 12 feet of stage. I'm going to zoom in, clicking my little zoom window here, or zoom button, to highlight that area of interest right here. Again, I would have notes that indicated where or what measurements were under what hydraulic control. And you can see, again, the area that is zoomed in is shown by this blue box, and the area I'm working on is down here in the zoom window. At this point, I'm going to make this a little bit larger, a little bit easier to deal with. We are now ready to start defining this section control of our rating curve with some input points and an offset. Recall that when we cloned this rating, we deleted all the offsets, so there aren't any offsets identified at this point. So let's go into the offset manager, turn on offset 1, and make sure that we're plotting everything to offset 1. This will ensure that our rating points show up when we add them graphically, and that when we start adjusting the offset, that we're plotting it properly and it's looking like we would expect it to look. So as was the case earlier in some of these videos, we discussed how it's good to use input 2 rating points. They define a straight line, and use that as your guide as you adjust the offset to try to get the measurements to plot on that straight line. So we're going to add a point down here at the bottom, somewhere near these lower points, these lower measurements. And then from my notes and from the plot of these measurements, I have essentially accepted the fact that the section control goes at least up to this measurement right here. So I'm going to try to stick the rating curve point right on that measurement. Now you start looking at the variable shift diagram shown on the lower right, and you start seeing a cluster of the measurements that are associated with this lower segment. You won't see any other measurements show up because the rating curve and rating input points don't go any higher than this measurement. So we can zoom in here, and as was the case before, it'd be nice to use this as a guide for adjusting the offset and removing some of the curved nature of the rating curve itself. And you'll notice the measurement that I've highlighted here in the halo is not showing up in the variable shift diagram. That's because this rating point is slightly below the gauge height of that measurement. So I want to move that just a little bit, get the measurement, get the rating to go straight through that point. Use it as a guide, so that's anchoring the top of the rating, which is shown by this 0 line in the variable shift diagram. And I will move this lower point just a little bit. It seems like it could be splitting those lower couple of measurements just a little bit better. And okay, that works out pretty good. It's time now to start adjusting the offset in an effort to get these measurements to plot more linearly, closer to our guide that we are using as defined by these 2 input points and the straight line. As we notice here, there is a curve with the plotting under the current offset. As we adjust the offset, as we raise the offset because it's concave, we should see these measurements start moving towards the left in more of a linear type of fashion up and down along this rating line as defined by the 0. So let's toggle the offset and see the measurements start to move over. You will notice that in the zoom window, the rating zoom window, I'm starting to lose the view of my rating curve, and that's because I do not have the automatic rating scale option on. If I had it on, this rating curve would keep zooming out to the entire plot, and that's not something I want to use. Recall earlier that we said there's times when you want this automatic rating scale to be on and times when you want it to be off. When dealing with a multiple offset rating, it's typically best to have it off. And so to get that rating curve back, I will go in here, grab the pan tool, and I will move this down. I will actually set this scale to be auto scaled back. Ooh, it moved them all on me. That's okay. I can zoom in, zoom back into my rating curve, and go from there. I can always move this around, but I can't hit that scale. It'll bump everything back up. So let's go back to where we were. We're at our offset, and we are increasing this until we think we see the measurements start to get in a straight line. And it's usually readily obvious when you've gone too far as the curve becomes convex and goes more off to the left. And that obviously happened there. So somewhere in here, about 7 point something, 7.4, 5, 6, it looks pretty darn good. Again, I probably want to make some adjustments of the bottom rating curve point here to get it more in line with these bottom measurements, split them a little bit better. And it looks like that's probably about as good as I am going to get, plus or minus a tenth here and there. Yeah, I'm going to go right about there. I think that looks pretty good for my section control, my first rating curve segment of this multiple offset rating. Let's unzoom the rating so we can see all of our measurements. I'm now ready to start working on the channel control segment of this rating curve. So I'm going to zoom into the segment of the rating curve that I believe to be associated with channel control. Now, if I had a cross section of this channel, I would have an elevation of about the top of the bank, which is about the point in which the control changes from channel control to overbank control. Essentially about the highest rating input point you would want to have for this segment of the rating curve itself. And so if I had that information, which ideally I would know about where to put my next highest rating input point. I don't have that information here for this example, but looking at the curve, it has to be somewhere right around in here at about, I don't know, 11,000 cubic feet per second or so. So I'm going to stick a rating point in there. Now I'm going to go into the offset manager, and I'm going to indicate that I want to add a second offset by clicking on this box. You'll notice that I'm still plotting to offset 1, which is associated with the lower section of this rating curve. And if I'm going to change the offset 2 at all, I'd like to see it plotted. So I'm going to click on offset 2 as the plotting offset. You'll notice when I toggled the fact that I wanted a second offset, all of a sudden a breakpoint value was populated down here in the offset manager. The breakpoint indicates the location or the gauge height in which the offset changes. And essentially it marks the location where the extrapolation in log space changes from one offset to the next offset. By default, when you click on an offset, it selects the lowest breakpoint or the lowest rating input point as the breakpoint. So you'll see if you look at this top screen, it selected my lowest rating input. And if you look at the rating table, you'll notice that the 8.63 stage value for the rating endpoint is gray. The proper location for this breakpoint is at about this stage of 11.42 feet. So I'm going to toggle up the breakpoint by clicking on this arrow, and by default it's going to go to the next rating input point. Now you notice that this rating input point is grayed out. I cannot edit it. I can't click on any of these boxes and change it, and I cannot come down into the zoom window and move this rating input point. It gives me an error. That's because it's an important point in the rating, and it is very important because of the way the extrapolation changes. The fact that I cannot move this point creates somewhat of an inconvenience when I'm trying to fit the straight line segment to the measurements down here by changing the offset. Remember how we adjusted the rating endpoints, the input points for the last segment we worked on to get things centered on the variable shift diagram and to get a better fit for the measurements? Well, I've got a little trick. I add an input point by clicking on this add rating point somewhere just above the rating, or just above this break point. So now I have the ability to move this point around as I see fit, as I'm trying to fit this line right here. So just as we did before, as far as changing the offset and moving rating input points, we're at that stage of the game for this segment of the rating curve. So I can move this point around just a little bit, try to get things worked out. And then I want to zoom out of the variable shift diagram and do my best to fit the upper portion of this segment with this rating point to somewhere over here so that this top point is near the zero line of the rating curve itself. So it's got to move just a slight little bit. Not much. Oh, went the wrong way. Come down here. And that's pretty close. I could probably go just a little bit that way. And now I'm pretty close to this zero line. And as you can see before, the offset that we're plotting this to, which is 0 right now, is causing the measurements to plot curvilinearly, concaved somewhat off of the rating curve. And it's a little more obvious here when you look at the zoom window. So I'm going to just toggle this offset and watch the measurements move, hopefully get closer towards that 0 line in the variable shift diagram and get a little bit closer to the line on the rating curve plot, the zoom window, by toggling this up. And you'll see I did pretty good for the segment up here, and I'm falling off a little bit here, and these aren't moving so much, and it's likely due to the way I put this input point in here. So I can move things around just slightly, just a little bit, see how we're doing. And that moves them over a little bit, gets things a little bit closer. Again, this is an iterative process like I explained before. And there's a chance that there's some clustering of measurements here that might not be that great to have in here at this point in time. So I'm at about the same offset I was before, but I think I went too far looking at this bend here and the convex shape of the curve that is starting to show up. So I'm going to back this down just a little bit, see if there's something I can do, see if I can get these measurements to plot a little better. Now they look really good in here, but I am struggling a little bit down here. So I'm going to move these around just a little bit, see what I can do. Try to get them to fit. That's getting a little bit better. So I'm going to keep moving around this lower rating point and see if I can get something a little bit better, a little bit closer. It seems I'm having some troubles getting the measurements in this area here to kind of plot that way. That looks a little bit better. I can back this down somewhat, see if I can't get these things to get more in a straight line. It's not too bad. And I'm going to move this one just a little bit more. And what you're noticing is there's an area in here right around the breakpoint that we call the transition zone. And typically there's a lot of noise in the measurements here. Things are changing. One control is drowning out, the other control is becoming active again. And so as we talked about earlier, and you'll learn about as you move along with rating curves, is that our goal is straight line segments for hydraulic controls, right? We are on the channel control segment here, and we dealt with the section control down here. So these are straight line segments defined by 2 points, but what we have to do in between is have a smooth transition of a curve to blend in these 2 straight line segments. And there's a chance that this area of the rating curve here is a little bit noisy. We're not going to get it on a straight line segment as we are for these measurements here. So I think we're doing pretty good. And for this demonstration, I think we'll call it good. So at this point, we think we're close enough, and we're ready to move on to our next rating control segment, which is the overbank flow. And so I'm going to auto scale, zoom back out, give a look at our rating. As we did for the channel control segment of this rating curve, now we're going to move in and zoom into the overbank control for this rating segment. So I'm going to draw the zoom box, and there we go. Again, ideally, we would have the elevation of the overbank where this breakpoint or this rating input point would be. Now we're going to add a rating input point at the high end, about where we think the top of the rating curve is, and it's pretty obvious here. This is the highest measurement we have for this site. So we're going to add a rating point smack dab on the middle of that rating input point. I'm going to auto scale this so that we start seeing all the measurements that we're dealing with, and I'm going to zoom in to about this segment, which is above 35 feet up until about, I don't know, 48 or something like that. That's the part I'm interested in. Now you'll notice that this part of a rating curve is typically quite flat. There's a lot of change in discharge for a little bit of change in gauge height. And in a lot of instances, unless you have a stream that experiences overbank flow somewhat frequently, or it's a very, very long period of record, you rarely have much definition in the upper end here, typically 1 or 2, maybe 3 measurements at most. And so it is difficult to resolve a good offset in this upper end for that reason. Luckily for us, for this example, we have a number of measurements up here, and there is some scatter going on, which would be expected at that type of a flow. So we're going to turn on a third offset, click on it, and we would like it to plot to that offset. Now you notice when I toggled the third offset, I by default get a breakpoint at the highest rating point, which doesn't make sense, right? We should have the breakpoint located between the control segments, right? So I can just radio button this down one or up one, down one, and it'll go to that last input point that I had, which ideally would be about the top of the bank. I'm going to use that same trick I mentioned earlier so that I have some flexibility in moving rating input points and fitting the measurements as best I can to this top end. So I'm going to input a point somewhere just above that rating breakpoint that we have right there. And, you know, I talked about smoothing between segments. This is definitely a location where you're going to have to input a series of points that nicely curve this straight line segment associated with channel control into the overbank section control to bend it over nice and smooth so you don't have a hard angle or a rapid change in the change in discharge per gauge height. So you're going to have a nice smooth curve elbow that's going to go in here. So I mean, I'm going to put another point in here just for fun, just to kind of illustrate that. But typically what you're going to have to do when the rating's all done is put a nice smooth curve in here with a series of input points. So I mentioned earlier that typically you don't have much definition at this upper high end overbank section of the rating, and it's difficult to kind of resolve a true offset for it because there's not much curve, there's not enough points, there's a lot of scatter similar to what we're seeing here. And so we'll do our best here and try to increase the offset and see if we can have any success, or decrease the offset to see if we have any success bringing these values any closer to each other and getting more lined up here on the 0 line, which represents the rating curve. Oh, and I've noticed this rating point or this measurement is not being shown up here because the rating curve isn't far enough out. So let's move that just a wee bit. There we go. And it's about on the 0 line. So you'll see we have some convex action going on right here. It could be something that we need to just kind of increase this slightly, make it a little bit smoother going through to start ourselves out, see if we can get this relationship to work itself out somewhat. So I'm going to toggle this up, see if we can get these measurements to move, And like I was expecting, we're not seeing much difference here, much change going on. And part of it's because it's such a flat relationship with this upper end, not to mention the fact that there's a bunch of scatter. Even though it does look like we have some kind of curvature going on around here, which could be a function of our scatter and measurements. So again, it's an iterative process. You can try a number of things, see if you have any luck. Perhaps the breakpoint needs to be lowered slightly, or you can work something out by moving around, get things to show up a little bit better. But it could be a tough challenge at this upper end to get things to match up. So I'm going to keep moving this, see if I can get something to happen. See if I can watch and see if there's any inflection that happens up here. And I'm not seeing too much. And when that's the case, and I'm kind of really not doing myself any good as far as getting an offset that's working for me, I will typically just assign the same offset that I had in the previous section for this upper section and go from there. I definitely want to make sure that the rating curve goes through this top point, and I want to make sure I end up with a nice smooth type of transition down here, something we're going to have to work on with our rating input points. It would be worth looking at these measurements, which one's the most recent of them all. For example, that's from 1969. This one here is from 1983. And filter these out a little bit. Go for the most recent higher water measurements when there's a cluster like this and try to draw your rating through them. So that about wraps it up for going through the process of developing a multiple offset rating. Remember, this was just one recommended approach to developing multiple offset ratings using GRSAT. It was stepwise. It worked from one rating segment to the next rating segment and onwards. And understand that after you resolve these straight line segments for the different controls, you need to go back and smooth the transitions around the breakpoints. And that requires looking at the expanded rating table, making sure discharge isn't changing too fast per unit of gauge height, and inputting some points to make a nice smooth curve that connects these straight line segments that you've worked so hard on.